Hello, thank you very much for inviting me, Sabina. It's just massively exciting to be speaking here today. I'm waiting for that to change. It's changed. So what I'm going to talk about today is a piece of research that I've been doing that looks at the overlap between childhood and landscape. And it's describing landscape as a place in time, a place in space, and childhood as a space in time, place in time, and how we understand how the two connect to each other. Do we really understand what's happening when children touch a landscape with the tips of their fingers and the soles of their feet? And is such an understanding of any use to us that are the makers of designed landscapes? This is a question that's obsessed me, really, for a couple of decades. I think I have a very strong and vivid, almost synesthetic memory for the places I experienced as a child. And one of these places was the Camden Square Community Play Centre in northwest London, where my brother and I played with our friends when I was around 9 and 10 years old. And it was called the Square, so that's what I'll talk about it as. And it was a staffed playground, so it wasn't just open. You had people were there. And these are two of the play workers, Abdul and George. More about them later. And it existed between approximately 1972 and 1987. So vague is that an ephemeral is this place that no one actually can date it quite. But I tried for ages to find evidence about the play centre. And then Abdul, who was that nice chap with the little glasses, I got in touch with him and he handed me this scruffy folder of negatives that he'd taken in the square in specifically 1978 and 79. And they were all in those little tracing paper sleeves. They were really nice. And he'd never printed loads of them. He'd developed them in the hut, in the play centre. And, but when I began to archive them and scan them, which took a long time, actually, it really jumped off the page. They were very artistically strong. They were emotionally appealing. They were conspicuously striking. And I felt that with a lot of interest now, again, in photographers like Shirley Baker and Roger Main, those are those images, those classic images of children kicking balls in the scruffy streets. They're attracting a lot of attention. I felt Abdul's photos had a value in that tradition. And I found it absolutely mesmerizing to have my mental scrapbook of these little memories and then have the photographic evidence of the real thing. And the lost playground came alive, and I felt like something was really being given back to me. Things that I thought were fragmentary memories, and had I really dreamed this place? Did it really exist? This place, it belonged to the children, and it existed. And that was so exciting to learn. So I now knew I could trust my memory. It wasn't just a dream. And I began piecing together the playground's history. And one of the early things I found out was that this thing where landscapes can have uses associated with them over a long period of time. This had been a landscape of leisure since the 1850s, this piece of land. You can see on this current slide those big villas around the square that were built in 1850, and this was the gardens, and then it was the tennis courts. And then after the war, they put a few bits of play equipment there. And then a very exciting thing happened in 1970 when the playground supervisor's hut got featured on the cover of Cat Stevens' first album. And they sent a photographer down, and these children for the playground, and this hut that says Camden Square and then some expletives was featured on the album cover. But in 1971, the community who lived in this square around did a remarkable thing, and 943 local people petitioned Camden Council for a play centre. Extraordinary local support. We're all familiar with NIMBYistic. We don't want a playground here, but they wanted that playground, and they campaigned for it. And so Camden Council said yes, and they drew up these. They got these 2 shipping containers, and I've tried to track the architects that designed it all. And these things you can see in the background at the moment, this wooden stuff was all built then. So what was it like to actually play in the square, which I did? Well, we were drawn to the square by curiosity about what might be happening there that day. Even though it had been initially built by the council, the square belonged to us, and we were always doing things to it with wood and rope and string and paint and burning bits of it. And Abdul, who took these photographs, he remembers he was always getting offcuts of carpets and things that he would get for us to make things with. And there was always a big fire smouldering away in one corner. Remember this slide, I'll talk about it later. And there was these games of bordering, which is when children jump onto the rope that's swinging one by one, and so there's about 5 of them in this knot, and they're all screaming, and then they all jump off into a big net. And there was arts and crafts going on, and I found my diaries. When I was 9, I won an art competition in the square, sort of high point of my career. I think it's really common to overlook the predominantly sociable nature of play, but at the square, our play was all about hanging out, the highs and lows of friendships, conflicts, laughs, romances, dramas, fights, and I've managed to collate quite a bit of oral history around this project. And Sharon Sparks is someone who actually turns out to live really near to me now. She played there in the 70s, and she talked very movingly to me about the square. She says, there were 4 lots of age groups, and we all got on really well. Seldom was there fights or arguments, and we all had each other's backs. The older lot looked after the younger lot like a family. And indeed, Abdul's pictures are full of older children holding babies or helping toddlers go to the toilet, often not in quite the right places, but there you go. And Abdul's attitude, he says it was fun, so the whole notion of enjoyment was there. So I found this resuscitation of memory and really recalled this very forensic quality of children's attention to the details of their environment, which I think means a lot for us landscape architects. For example, there was this mysterious concrete plinth. This one of the stories, all these little details get these stories attached to them. And it turns out that this mysterious concrete plinth that we lit fires on or used as a stage or a prison, and we incorporated it in our play, and it was the plinth of the hut that had been on Cat Stevens' album cover. And even the fences of the playground. Remember that slide I showed you with the hole in the fence? Well, the thing was that the gate of the square was in the wrong place. So you couldn't get to the sweet shop. And we were always climbing over the fences until one day someone made that little hole in the fence. And there was another story about the fence. Sharon Sparks says, there used to be spikes on the fences, but Martin Connolly slipped and fell on them when he was trying to climb the tree in the corner and caught his armpit, so all the spikes got cut off. And I remember feeling empowered by this kind of child-centered manipulation of the fabric of the square. And I think a little bit of that goes into why I maybe had the idea to be a landscape architect. And then even this little story of this back gate gets embedded, because today, when they redeveloped the square in the 90s, they put the gate in the space where the hole in the fence was. So the square may have been an urban project, but great value was placed on the camps and trips to the seasides, a reaction against the city that underscored the relationship with land and landscape that was, again, at the root of this project. Abdul has images of skinny city kids buried in sand, running wild in the hills and stick fighting in the forest. It was obviously really hard work for the adults. They had to make do and mend and improvise and feed all these children. And there's pictures of rain-soaked children. They're just wearing bin bags with holes cut in the arms and for arms and legs, arms and heads. So today's playgrounds are often designed to cosmetically resemble the adventure playgrounds of old, but the world has moved on, and although genuine adventure playgrounds can still be found, about 150 of them still exist from 800 in their heyday. It's hard to see how a project like the Square could be authentically replicated today. Pessimistic, maybe. On a large scale, so in terms of this kind of idea of this infrastructure, this is almost the opposite. It's very bottom-up, it's very intimate, it's very place-based. And for one thing, another thing is children were basically given so much more freedom and independence. We went to the Square without our parents, we came and went as we pleased. And then just the whole, today's standards regulated social relations. So there was a lack of boundaries and a terrific informality that children really crave. And Abdul talks about how he'd come in on Christmas Day. There'd be children in the playground, and he'd come in and open up the square, and the parents would come down and bring the Christmas dinners. So that you could never imagine that happening in a sort of council-run playground today. And they used to go out and help people in the community. Abdul says, if someone wanted help moving something, we'd grab a couple of the youngsters, we'd go across, and we'd help them move bits and pieces or do little things. So there was this terrific flow between the community and the playground. The Square's play leaders were absolutely different to normal adults. They were so cool, they were rebellious, they were hilarious. But there was, they were employed by the Social Services Department, not the Parks and Leisure. And their commitment to the children's lives went beyond play. Abdul says, "You worked with them all, you didn't exclude anybody. We were a stabilising influence for quite a lot of folk. We could keep them under check." It's a whole social infrastructure that we don't talk about very much in this kind of context. And in the mornings, Abdul occasionally found children had slept in the square at night, and it was for them a sense of a refuge or a sanctuary. And there's a little bit of the children's sort of folklore. They called the higher, that very first platform I showed you, the first slide, they called that the flood level. So in that landscape was this idea of refuge from a biblical flood. So it goes so close into this mythical folklore ideas of the children by calling this the flood level. Children, neither voters nor consumers, they're essentially powerful, but powerless. But our generation of Camden children benefited from a progressive commitment to play, which the council promoted as a child's form of work. The square existed in a bubble of naive optimism and anarchic enthusiasm. That's the time when architecture students were going into the inner cities and forming all sorts of projects. There's a radical counterculture which counted children as its constituency. Had legendary festivals. You've probably seen already some pictures of donkey rides and steel bands, face painting, candy floss, sack races, huge beer tent, and Madness, the band Madness, they used to drop in, and Pete Townsend gave a gig, you know, so it was really very alive place. But there's a really serious side to this, a deadly reminder of, it's just because it's called play, this is a serious business. It's a matter of life or death. And as I was doing this research, what Sharon was telling me, and children, I remembered that many of the children didn't make it through. Because Camden Town had fashion and music, but this was also near King's Cross with drugs and crime, and trouble was never hard to find. So it was that nearly sort of stopped me in my tracks of working on this project, was to discover this wasn't some nice little esoteric project. This was actually, many children had died from drugs and crime. And but Sharon Sparks, who I talked to, she remembers how the play leaders had such a big influence on us as we grew older, even though those that went astray, they tried their best. So in the community to this day, those play leaders' efforts are remembered. So what's this got to do with landscape? Well, I think these anecdotes and memories absolutely attest to the significance of landscape to the condition of childhood. Oh, she was in Grange Hill, this girl. She was Ronnie. The intimacy with which children interact with landscape in the guise of play. So beach, park, garden, playground, forest, and then you've got climbing, hiding, seeking, sandcastles, dens, muds, fire sticks, swimming, running. So outside of the internet, very little play is possible without some kind of engagement with the landscape outside your skin. And if we're talking about landscape as infrastructure, well, maybe we should also frame landscape itself as part of the infrastructure of childhood. And I would suggest it's quite problematic how little we talk about this. It's my impression within the profession, may be wrong. And there is one special corner of this discussion which belongs to landscape architecture, which is the story of the adventure play movement, which originated in Denmark during World War II, when the landscape architect Theodore Sorensen, anyone with any information about Sorensen, please do tell me. He's such an intriguing character and there's very little about him. He watched children playing on bomb sites and derelict land.
1 minute.
Okay. Anyway, he made his adventure playgrounds, and there were, wood and metal and fires and things. And Sorensen really believed that the children thrive and unfold. What I believe is going on in such landscapes is that they embody the inner turmoil of the child, and in doing so, give children permission to give expression to this chaotic and disordered emotional landscape. Whoa. But there's a second landscape architect, whoa, double points for landscape architecture, which is Lady Allen of Hurtwood. Lady Allen brought the model to Britain and really is a heroine. And her rallying cry, a very odd approach to risk assessment, but her rallying cry was, "Better a broken bone than a broken spirit." So the final comments, if I may. Sorensen admitted that his playground looked quite squalid, and his comment was, of all the things I've helped to realise, the junk playground is the ugliest. Yet for me, it's the most beautiful of my works. And I find it endlessly curious that this most significant of contributions to landscape architecture should be a sort of anti-design that's produced by child builders with little aesthetic consideration and minimal involvement of the professionalised adult. And while this talk predominantly concerns the minutiae of the child's relationship with landscape in the guise of play, the discussion is incomplete without locating the child in the context of the city. And if we're taking this conversation forward, as we are here today, or very busily and productively doing so, we do need to talk about how city makers and infrastructure builders blindly privilege the motor car over the child, sacrificed open space to bricks and mortar, and enclose children within actual and virtual architectures that curtail their ability to spend time outside, connecting with landscapes in the company of other children.